Excellent. Well, welcome everyone to our World Water Day event for 2023. I'm Scott Miller. I'm the Executive Director for the North Saskatchewan Watershed Alliance, and I have the privilege of being your host for today. And just a few things I want to cover before we get to the main event, which is our two speakers for today. First, I'd like to start off in a good way by acknowledging that the place settlers call Alberta is the traditional and ancestral territories of many people who have lived and cared for this land since time immemorial. This includes the people largely of Treaty 6, 7, and 8, but also portions of Treaty 4 and Treaty 10. It also includes the Métis homeland, Métis Nation, Métis settlements. So we make this acknowledgement to recognize the Indigenous people who are the original stewards of this land. And we wish to express our gratitude both to the Indigenous people who have cared for the land and the water, but also to the land and the water itself for telling us their stories and giving us their gifts. We make this land acknowledgement also to recognize the role of watershed management and its practitioners in perpetuating a colonial system that excludes and ignores the wisdom offered by Indigenous culture and science. And today's webinar theme around collaborating with nature and each other is a way that we can start to think about how we can correct some of those colonial systems into the future. And so I ask you all to pause for a moment and reflect on how we might improve watershed stewardship in collaboration with Indigenous people. So please take your reflections from today into today's webinar. Together we can learn to better understand the historical connotations of we and they, and join the common ground that is us, and move forward in our learning journey in a good way. So today is World Water Day. This is an annual United Nations observance that started 30 years ago in 1993, and it happens every year on March 22nd. It's a day to celebrate water, raise awareness about global water issues, and to draw attention to just how important water is in our lives. And the theme for UN Water Day this year is accelerating change, which we've now built into the theme for our webinar today, which is collaborating with nature and each other. It's an important theme because it raises questions about, what is it we need to change? What is it we need to accelerate? Who needs to be involved? And how can we be more inclusive in that space? So how can we move from a place of conflict between different perspectives to a collaboration against a problem or problems? Watershed planning and advisory councils, we call them WPACs for people who aren't sort of in the groove on this. They came to life as a result of the Alberta Water for Life strategy back in 2003. And it was a recognition within the strategy of the power of partnerships and collaborating through those partnerships to achieve outcomes on the ground. Over time, we've developed 11 different watershed groups, WPACs, across almost the entire province, all with the same kind of goals around raising our understanding of the individual watersheds, and also addressing issues sort of specific to each watershed. But regardless of which watershed you're in and which WPAC you might be involved with, we all believe that collaboration of all types across organizations and cultures and generations is integral to affecting change. We work with a network of decision makers and influencers and academics, experts and funders, non-governmental organizations, Indigenous organizations. And all these connections and collaborations are necessary so that we can bridge across perspectives and really create on-the-ground change. I believe there's a lot more to do. more voices that we need to hear from. So today we have two extraordinary speakers, each giving us a glimpse into the world of watershed stewardship. And I encourage you all to sort of listen intently, think of your questions, think about our land acknowledgement, and share your thoughts in the chat as we go through. Before we get to our speakers, there's a couple of housekeeping items. Of course, we'd like to keep our cameras off and our mics muted just so that we preserve the almighty bandwidth. If you have any questions or comments, for instance, if you'd like to share what treaty area you're joining from or where you're coming from, if you're not within Alberta, just pop that in the chat. You already know the event is being recorded. We also are doing a prize giveaway. So you'll hear from Jill and Kate a little bit later, but essentially there's going to be one lucky winner is winning a riparian web portal backpack, a caring for our watershed dry bag, and some other cool swag from Alberta Environment and protected areas. That comes at the end of the webinar. So Jill's going to launch a quick poll that should pop up on your screen. And simply asking, what watershed are you from? We'll give a couple seconds for that. I'm watching the results stream live onto my screen. It's looking like, well, Bow River's kind of in the lead. North Saskatchewan's second, it looks like. It's a bit of a neck and neck battle. Nobody from the Beaver River yet. Come on, Beaver. Mighty Peace is a little quiet too. All right. We'll give it another second. It looks like it's calmed down. All right, so the results are in. Looks like North Saskatchewan is in the lead with 29%. Bow is close behind with 25%, so that's pretty awesome. Lots of good participation from across the province. Milk River is 13%, South Saskatchewan is 5%. Yeah, that's an awesome representation from across the province. So thanks everyone for participating in that. I'll leave it to you, Jill, to share or pop it down or whatever you like. All right, catch up on my paperwork here. All right, so now it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker for the day. Get my thing up to speed. So Dr. Glynnis Hood is an ecologist and a professor of environmental science and the vice dean at the University of Alberta's Augustana College campus in Camrose. And so prior to signing on with the university, she worked for 24 years in protected areas across Canada, from the west coast to the subarctic. In 2007, she left a 19-year career with Parks Canada Warden Service and followed her passion to teaching and into research. She's got quite a variety of interests, including aquatic ecology, wildlife management, and human-wildlife interactions. And she is the author of the Semi-aquatic Mammals, Ecology and Biology, and that's one book, and also the Beaver Manifesto. She's got her first children's book is out, A Cabin Christmas. It was released just this last November. So today, Glynnis is going to be talking a little bit about the human-wildlife interface, specifically as it relates to some of her favorite animals, the semi-aquatic ones, specifically the beaver. So if you have questions for Glynnis that you'd like to ask, we're saving them up till the end of the presentation. So please jot them in the chat, and Jill and Kate will keep tabs on those throughout the presentation, and they'll come up at the end. Glynnis, I'm going to pass it over to you. I'll let you, I guess I'll stop sharing my screen. If you would like to share your screen.
Okay, that sounds good. So let me just start here. Let me just get this going here. There we go. So I think you could probably see a beaver. Am I right?
You're good.
And you can hear me fine. So I want to welcome you to my world, which pretty soon is going to be having actual moving animals in the water again. So the weather here is quite nice and the beavers are probably getting keen to get out of their lodges. So I want to thank you for this invitation to speak today. And as always, I really struggle to come up with new titles for my talk. And then I thought about one of the themes of World Water Day, and it was that it's a once in a generation opportunity to unite around water and accelerate progress together. That's what they've written on their website. And although my research is often pared down to hypothesis testing and sampling designs, it ultimately shares the goal of advocating for the sustainable management of freshwater resources. And that's another goal for World Water Day. So the thing is, my difference is that I have a lot of furry colleagues that do all the heavy lifting for me. And so this is a beaver named Brownie. I didn't name it, but it is brown, and working on a lodge near Bowden, Alberta. And so I'm going to give you a little bit of a tour of some of the basics on beaver and then some of the research that I've been working on over the past while and where I'm headed with Dr. Sherry Westbrook on some really interesting research coming forward. So the first question people might ask is why beavers? And I get that a lot. Sometimes I get stopped in grocery stores and I'm called the beaver lady, and I'm not sure if it's a compliment or just associating me with this furry mammal with buck teeth. I don't know. But if you'd asked me about 20 years ago if I'd still be studying beavers now, I'd probably say an emphatic no. My master's degree was building habitat suitability models for grizzly bears, and I've worked with a number of other species as well. But the ecological and hydrological influence of these ecosystem engineers has really kept my research program well supported with endless research questions. And that's whether they're about aquatic biodiversity, aquatic connectivity, nutrient fluxes, or surface and groundwater storage. And more recently, I've been collaborating, as I said, with Dr. Sherry Westbrook out of the University of Saskatchewan to investigate the use of beavers as a nature-based solution to manage the impacts of climate change. So here we have an image on one of my absolutely favorite days of the year. This is Bee Day, and that's the day that the beavers come out of their lodge for the very first time after a very long winter and start swimming around in that open water just in front of their lodges. And they're probably pretty sick of each other by that point. But even the creation of this open water right in front of their lodges is actually quite amazing. The water in these ponds that otherwise are frozen for anywhere up to 6 months of the year actually opens up 11 days earlier in front of beaver lodges than it does in areas where we don't have beavers in the same ecosystem. And so even with that, we have water availability, nutrient fluxes happening earlier, waterfowl finding areas to rest. And so even this small little action by beavers of having this water open up sooner links to climate change and water availability and overall aquatic health. So again, the question comes up, why beavers? Well, let's go back to a time in 1924. And so here we have an oblique photo of Elk Island National Park with the Stoughton Lake in the background. And some of you might be familiar with this park that's about 45 kilometers east of Edmonton. And you can see that there are many areas that had wetlands throughout here. You can see these dry things that look like meadows. Well, those are old wetlands. And this is what the landscape looked like after beavers had been extirpated in the 1870s. So about 50 years of a landscape without beavers. And in some of these areas, beavers were even extirpated much sooner than that because of the fur trade. So it left a really dry landscape. And I've got many of these images of Elk Island where it just shocks me when I see the extent of surface water loss during this time period. The aquatic life that was once supported by these wetlands is also gone. But if we look at the same landscape today, taken off of Google Earth, even if we ignore the difference between the black and white and the color imagery, we see distinct differences in the amount of water and hence aquatic connectivity and habitat creation on the landscape. So I'm going to take you back to one of my earlier studies right now. So during my PhD, I conducted a study with Dr. Suzanne Bailey in Elk Island National Park, and this was starting in the early 2000s. And so I compared about 54 years of aerial photographs dating back to 1940s, all the way up into the 2000s, and started digitizing, so drawing outlines of all the wetland, all the wetted area basically in the park over all of those years that I had aerial photographs for. And so we had 2 years that really stood out. So 1950, there were no beavers in the park yet. There was sort of this small recolonization of the park, some reintroduction projects happening, but overall in the park, there weren't a whole lot of beavers, if any, in most parts of the park. So that's 1950. In 2002, there was a really well-established beaver population. The year 1950 was the second driest year of our study period and the fourth driest year on record in East Central Alberta. The year 2002 was the driest year on record. It was the driest year since we've been keeping climate records since, well, I think 137 years at that point. It was a devastating drought that was happening right in the middle of my research. And I thought, wow, I'm losing my ponds as I'm trying to get data for my PhD. But it turned out to be one of the most interesting parts of the research. So the year 2002, again, driest year on record. And even though 1950 was a very dry year, there was 47% more precipitation in 1950 than in 2002. But there was 61% less open water on the landscape. As soon as beavers came back, even in this dramatic drought, we started to see that we had over 61% more open water. So beavers, in a sense, were mitigating the effects of drought by maintaining wetlands when those without beavers were disappearing. And I'll note one thing that's really special about this landscape that you'll really need to know as we talk a little bit more about these animals, is that there aren't a lot of permanent streams and there are no major rivers in the Beaver Hills in which Elk Island is situated. So these are what we call geographically isolated wetlands. So you're thinking, well, how are beavers keeping water on the land then if they're not building dams and doing that? So I want you to keep that question in your mind and we'll investigate it a bit further. So we sometimes say in ecology that we're quantifying and testing some things that are already inherently known. And so I'll find something new, like beavers are keeping water on the landscape, and an old farmer will say, well, I always keep beavers on the back 40 because I need water for my cattle in the driest of years. So we often test these things empirically, but there's a lot of cultural history and knowledge that's passed down through generations that could inform us as well. So despite getting a lot of attention, especially that article that I wrote on the beavers mitigating drought, my early research on beavers ultimately confirmed what some people already knew in the conservation field. So this is an article about the Manistic Game Bird Sanctuary, which is also in the Beaver Hills in East Central Alberta. And it's from the Calgary Herald in 1953. And it says it all. So a little excerpt from it says, in 1953, judging the time ripe for restocking, Rennie Harley, Western manager of Ducks Unlimited, requested beaver from the Alberta Game Branch. 8 live adult beaver released on the sanctuary creeks. One pair raised the water level by 18 inches in one of the small lakes created by one of the new DU dams. Another pair created a new and private pond on the same creek by damming farther upstream. More live adult beaver were released during the following years and have more than doubled the amount of impounded water in the area in a comparatively short period of time. So Manistic, again, is at the heart of the Beaver Hills in East Central Alberta, and beavers were trapped out of that area as well. So let's go to modern day. So we're away from 1953, we're away from 1924, and we're into the year 2021 and still going strong in 2023. So almost 73 years later, in 2021, my research team and I conducted the first known park-wide beaver lodge occupancy survey in Manistic Game Bird Sanctuary by visiting every pond in the park where we identified possible beaver lodges from aerial photographs. So the park is approximately 74 square kilometers in size. Well, it took several weeks, but we mapped and assessed 324 lodges in the park, although we visited dozens of more ponds in search of lodges. And over 43% of the lodges were active, which you can see in red. The red dots indicate occupied lodges, and these are done in the winter, as I said. And Chelsea was standing on an active lodge there. That is a pretty high number compared to many other places that have conducted surveys. Beavers were back, as was the water. And so these lodges, the occupancy of them blinks on and off from year to year. So I often do regular occupancy surveys throughout the winter in various areas. So the return of beaver ponds represents a return of ecologically and hydrologically dynamic features on the landscape. And this is another study that I did within Miquelon Lake Provincial Park, which is just south of Manistic. So I wanted to quantify the physical effects of ponds and channels, those canals that beavers are digging out from the side of the ponds, and see just how they're changing these normally circular features of ponds into something more dynamic. And I call them my boreal neurons because they look like little neuron cells to me. And so with my team, I determined which ponds had been active for at least 3 years and currently active, and then which ones were not occupied for at least 3 years, and started doing some bathymetry measurements on them. And these are relatively shallow ponds. They're usually not much more than 2 meters deep, if that. And so you can see that, again, the red dots indicate active lodges here. And you can see that these channels create this tremendous change to the pond perimeters. So we were examining the length of these perimeters and comparing what if the pond had just stayed circular versus what happens when the beavers go in and start digging. And so these pond perimeters increased on average by 575%, so the length of them, and some ponds even increased by at least 2,000%. So that's tremendous when you think about the importance of that riparian interface between water and land and how much biodiversity benefits from that. So you can also see that they're digging the bottoms of these ponds and changing the morphometry of that. And so just by digging these channels, beavers displaced on average about 1,700 cubic meters of soil per square kilometer in this tiny 13 square kilometer provincial park. And what it does is it connects the aquatic system with upland habitats, but also connects some of these geographically isolated wetlands. So beavers don't just drive food webs by creating these wonderful systems where all these species come in and we've got tremendous biodiversity. They also engineer landscapes and dramatically increase that connectivity, that aquatic connectivity, and especially in these morainal landscapes like we have in the Beaver Hills. So I'm going to fly over Miquelon really quickly and look at the positive impacts by beavers. So they're engineering these channels or canals from pond to pond. So you can see the little beaver lodges here. Remember, beavers live in lodges. They build dams to stop water. And so we have all these beaver channels. Just dig, 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 dig. You can go anywhere you want. You can visit your friend, play a little canasta, come back, and you can just see beavers and the connectivity that they're making in an area where we don't have natural streams. And so it's just amazing when you think about the magnitude of change on a landscape that beavers can do. So I'm going to move you away from East Central Alberta and move you closer to the mountains and landscapes that have some steeper topography with more streams and rivers, such as the foothills and slopes of the Rocky Mountains, and in this case, west of Calgary. So there's always this concern that water stored behind beaver dams pose a significant threat to the human infrastructure. And so Dr. Westbrook and I are leading a research project in Sibyl Fenn. We have a graduate student that's working on some great modeling to determine the role of beaver dams in either exacerbating or mitigating extreme flooding. So I'm going to show you a little bit of what Calgary looked like on June 25th, 2013. We had a record-breaking drought that just flooded a lot of southwestern Alberta and actually into the southeastern part of British Columbia as well, where I'm from. And so this flood was downstream of areas like Sibyl Fenn, areas like Canmore and the Rockies, and the water just came in great quantities. So a lot of people started saying, well, you know, there's beaver dams up in the hills there, and they're breaking, and that's contributing to these massive flood events. And other people were saying, well, beavers might actually be helping. And so it was an interesting question to have. So this is beautiful Sibbald fen. This was taken with one of the drones that we've got. And it's a peatland that has really complex groundwater and surface water interactions. And it's also home to beavers. You can see the dams here. They make a lot of them out of peat. So remember that when you see the next slide. And they've been home to Dr. Sherry Westbrook's research for many years, and now I've got some students working there as well. And so we're joining forces to explore the structure and function of beaver dams relative to these extreme climate events. And so as I was hunkered down in Banff when the flood hit and unable to drive anywhere, Sherry and her team were actually already up at Sibbald Fen and at their research station, which gave them a prime opportunity to really assess how beaver dams reacted to this catastrophic flood that swept through southwestern Alberta. And from their paper, so I've got the name of their paper here, and then a little excerpt of figure 6 from their paper. From their paper, they stated that first, beaver dam sequences across Kananaskis, Alberta, were able to persist during a flood larger than floods previously described. Well, we did observe beaver dam failure across Kananaskis region during the flood. Overall, we found a greater number of sites where flood impacts to beaver dams did not follow expectations. Even at the sites where there was a mix of dams that failed and remained intact, it was often only the most upstream dam in the series that failed, with the others remaining intact. In reality, approximately, so this is just me telling you from eating lunch with Sherry out in the field, approximately 68% of the beaver dams in the fen were either intact completely or only partially breached, and likely held back some of that flood water that you saw in downtown Calgary that would have otherwise really increase the flows into downstream communities. But how they do it is the question that we're now trying to pursue. So here you've got a pond where, yeah, there's been a little bit of overtopping of water by the dam, but basically it held, and then a piece of peat, which is what the beavers are using to make these dams, that actually removed from one of the dams and went downstream. And so really beaver dams were probably mitigating some of that flooding. So, but it's naive to think, however, that beavers and humans always get along. So I've spent a lot of time looking at human beaver conflicts as well. So this trail's in the Cooking Lake Blackfoot Provincial Recreation Area, just south of Elk Island. And it was chronically flooded for over 10 years. And you can see my team in here trying to figure out how we're going to counter flooding on this trail that's being caused by beavers plugging culvert. So traditional methods for managing beaver dams would work for the short term, such as this backhoe, but they're often really expensive. A backhoe can cost anywhere from $300 to $500 an hour. And often the next morning you come back and the beavers have repaired the dam. So these are traditional methods. We don't use dynamite quite as much, but when I was in Parks Canada's warden service, this was a dam that we were working on in southern Elk Island. And I went along with the general works crew to see what they were doing and assessing the site relative to beavers. And they used a ton of dynamite in here. And you can see in this slide way up in the sky a piece of that dam. These guys aren't wearing hard hats, so it's about the only one who was. And blowing up dams can be quite risky. You should have seen these guys run after things started falling from the sky. But I came back the next morning and that dam was not only rebuilt, it was larger than before. So removing dams also has ecological impacts. The result of this activity often results in the complete draining of a wetland, even at sensitive times of the year, as with this image. This wetland was drained by removing a beaver dam. It was drained in May. This is in Elk Island National Park. And when frogs were in the pond, ducks had established their nests and beaver kits were still unlodged. So if we look at wetland compensation schemes in Alberta, this is a 2.5 hectare wetland in a prime area of wetland habitat in Alberta. It would have cost over $45,000 of compensation with a permit if it had been drained by a contractor or private citizen. So we're doing a lot of wetland drainage, just combating beavers. So I thought, well, I better put my money where my mouth is and decide on how to maybe approach mitigating these human wildlife conflicts. So pond levelers is one way to counter flooding by beavers while still keeping the wetland and its associated biodiversity intact. So this is one of my teams way back when. They're both now got their graduate degrees and are happily and gainfully employed, but they're building the cage that we use to protect the end of the pipe that the water goes into. And then we're floating that cage out. I'll show a closer picture there. We drop the cage and the pipe, and then the rest of the pipe goes through the dam at a level at which we want the water to stay static. So here's a area in Beaver County, just east of where I am here in Camrose, and we're prepping the floating out of this cage. We've got what we call the red man suit, which is a dry suit that everybody tries to get into and float out there with the cage. And then we place the rest of the pipe after we break the dam a little bit where we want the dam waters to, pond waters to stay. So again, we protect that cage so beavers can't fill that part of the pipe with water. And every time the pond gets too high, it starts to draw water and send it over the dam. And then when it gets to its desired level, it stops again. And it actually works really well. So these systems can work with great success and can save tens of, not thousands of dollars. We did a cost benefit analysis on this. And for 13 sites in the Cooking Lake Blackfoot Provincial Recreation Area, we calculated that there was an overall benefit of anywhere from about $80,000, and that's without some extra costs that we can put into a model, which put it into the tens of thousands of dollars of savings, or hundreds of thousands of dollars of savings. And we don't have to go through twice a year, once in spring, once in the fall, and just clean out any sticks or anything that were problematic. And many of these lasted for well over 7 years. So more and more beaver researchers are investigating the role of beavers and how they might mitigate the effects of climate change and how they relate to ecohydrology and biodiversity. So the answer lies at this interface of ecology, ecohydrology, and conflict management, and using many of the tools that you've seen today. So with that said, and as with all things water and wildlife, these are really complex questions within the world of science. But the enduring beauty that affects us all when we do preserve these wonderful watersheds and wetland areas is really important, as we've seen over the past few years. So I hope today that this talk helped bring this complexity to a new understanding of how our aquatic systems and our well-being and future in a warming world can maybe be addressed in creative and ecological ways. So with that, I'll thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you, Glynnis, for that. Jill and Kate, I know you probably are compiling a few questions from the chat, so I'll turn it over to you in just half a second. But I'm gonna monopolize and ask the first question, which is kind of around where we should be going with beaver management. And I'm thinking from the perspective of a watershed group like us, we often do things like riparian or wetland strategies and all of these things. And it seems to me we're often silent on the nature side of it, so the collaborating with nature. Do you see any examples come to mind where beavers have sort of been integrated into the ecosystem management in a way that we should be paying attention to?
Well, it's happening globally, actually. There's only 2 species of beavers. So the North American beaver, Castor canadensis, and the Eurasian beaver, Castor feber. And there's been many reintroduction projects. In the United States, in dryland areas such as Utah and parts of Oregon state, they do try to reintroduce beavers, or they create beaver dam analogs, which have mixed success, where they try to pretend that they're making beaver dams. But I'll get into that in a sec. But so there have been active reintroduction programs. I think that's what was going on in Manistic. In 1941, beavers were reintroduced to Elk Island. In the 1990s, they were being reintroduced all over Europe. So people, and right now, as we speak, they're being reintroduced to parts of Britain. A lot of that is to try to increase this biodiversity, have an attention to surface and groundwater storage as well. And the thing is, you have to do it with science well, for the well-being of the animal, because sometimes people just put beavers where they think they want there to be water, and beavers often move away from those sites, and then they either get predated on, or we don't know what their fate is, or they go set up in a place that's less appropriate for reducing human beaver conflict. So there is a lot going on, actually. Cows and Fish in Alberta has many resources online for coexisting with beavers, and the Mystakis Institute out of Mount Royal University has done brilliant work. So we've all collaborated together, and then they've really run with it. So there's a lot going on for that.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Jill, I'm not sure who's got the question, Jill or Kate, but I'll open it to you guys to ask the first question from the floor.
Awesome, thanks. First one is, how did you verify the occupancy of the beaver lodges, and how did you map the bathymetry?
Okay, those are great questions. So occupancy is actually best done in the wintertime. And we have several different characteristics that we use. One is that we look for a food cache having been established, that the lodge is kept up, so there's fresh mudding on it, there's fresh sticks on it. We can even use the surrounding landscape to see if there's been cutting happening there in the fall, because you can tell the difference between a freshly cut stem and not. And then on the really cold days, it's great. You can actually see the steam, and you can smell the lodges before you see them. There's even been coyotes that a friend of mine saw coyotes lying on top of one of the vent holes on the top of the lodge, where the hot air from inside the lodge comes out, lying on top of it at -30, I think to stay warm and to also dream of Kentucky fried beaver. So I think that's there's some real gives. And so if you are doing these, stay away from the food cache though, because the ice at the food cache is only about 3 centimeters thick. 10 meters out, it can be up to 75 meters or more, or 75 centimeters or more thick, but 3 centimeters at the food cache because of that interface with beavers inside. So how did I map the bathymetry? Well, these ponds are so shallow, I couldn't use a lot of sonar. I did have one little handheld sonar that wasn't terribly effective. So we did it old school. We had GPS units and measuring rods and just made a grid system across these ponds, incorporated into a GIS, did some work with spatial analyst and 3D analyst, and was able to calculate a whole bunch of different metrics on it. It was a lot of work, but it was one of the funnest papers I've ever done once I figured out the GIS methods to try to get the bathymetry to work.
Oh, fascinating. Well, I guess, Kate, next question.
Yeah, so there's a bit of discussion in the chat. So there is the question, how do you know when B Day is each year? And then there was a reply, it's April 7th. But is it the same every year, and how do you know?
No, it depends. Well, April 7th is International Beaver Day. We have a press release ready to go here from the University of Alberta. So yes, April 7th is International Beaver Day. So just know that you've got something really important to look forward to in the beginning of April. But for B Day, it changes. And if we have a really cold, long winter, it might be a little bit later. So I've seen it anywhere from early March in a really warm winter to extending even into April. So I just watch. I look out my window because I am surrounded by 3 beaver, a beaver pond. Kate's been there, and some beaver lodges, and they live in just the one lodge over the winter. So I know which lodge is active, and I just wait and wait until I can see those beavers out on the ice there. So, and it'll be different wherever you are depending on your temperatures.
Excellent, thank you. Is there another question from the chat? Go ahead.
Yeah, we got actually your question, Scott. But
oh.
In the 50s, beavers were introduced, and there was a positive effect on water retention. But given the changes happening due to climate, earlier runoff, drier summers, will we see a reduction in beaver populations? Good question, by the way.
Yeah, it's an excellent question, because you know that study I did in Elk Island, sure, the populations actually didn't decline that much despite the drought. But what we saw after that was really interesting, and I don't have empirical evidence for this, but I've talked to the provincial wildlife disease specialists as well. We started finding a lot of beavers dead from tularemia, or more than we were used to. So what happened was the dispersing beavers probably didn't leave because there was no other habitat for them to go to. So beavers actually were a little bit more crowded up in the lodges. The water was shallower, a bit warmer, a great breeding ground for bacteria, which, you know, tularemia. And so we ended up with sort of this lag effect where then the populations dropped. I saw a similar thing after the 2009 drought, but then you end up seeing this gradual increase again as water comes back. So I think that that's what we're probably going to see is climate change is about hotter temperatures and sometimes less precipitation, but it can also be about 2013 and massive influxes of precipitation and extreme weather events. Anybody who was on Highway 2 last August and had the hailstorm from with the giant damage that was done to cars. I mean, we have these extreme events, so that can change just how much water we get. I do know that there is a bit of a breaking point, though, that some ponds just can't retain water, and if beavers don't have water, they struggle, and then they start dispersing at odd times, and then the predators really take hold. But they are moving up to the Arctic and the tundra as things warm too. The shrubification of the Arctic is happening. And so as the shrubs start to grow more and more in Arctic and tundra systems because of global warming, the beavers are following them. And so that's a whole other dimension to global warming. And there's a network called the Arctic Beaver Observation Network that I'm associated with. And they're tracking what's happening in peatland or in permafrost areas with beavers coming in.
Oh, it's fascinating. So they're expanding their range. They're also like pretty resilient.
They go all the way from the Gulf of Mexico up to the Arctic Ocean, from the Pacific to the Atlantic. They're one of the most widely ranged animals in North America, certainly. And so they adapt to tourists on March break, well, maybe not in Florida, but maybe in Mexico, northern Mexico, and all the way up to the Arctic. So they can adapt to their environments really well.
Yeah, I know they've been introduced to Argentina.
Yes, that was a bad mistake. There
Yeah.
are places where beavers shouldn't be. Argentina and Chile are two places where they shouldn't be.
That's for sure. All right. Next question.
Next question. Do you have any insights into how beaver dams either support or impair fish movement?
I'll give you one of those answers that isn't an either or. It depends on the fish. So there are some fish that can pass barriers quite easily. Some salmonids actually use beaver ponds as rearing habitat for like young coho. And there are other species like, let's say, pike, which aren't going to be jumping or getting through those at all. But some fish do take advantage of these overflow events to get up and over. So I would say there's more and more research, but not a lot, being done on fish movement. And it really depends on the species, but they aren't a complete barrier for every species, as a lot of people say. There have been many, many beaver dams pulled out to allow fish passage, where they're actually destroying the rearing habitat of some fish. So I think, again, follow the science and then make the statement.
Jill, are there any other questions?
We do. We have a few more.
Yeah, keep going.
Yeah. There was apparently a Athabasca grade 9 math class, and they want to measure the span of the largest beaver house. Another class that wants to know where the largest beaver house is.
Okay, well, I've never measured the size of a beaver house, but I probably will now, just because you've got my curiosity going. So you'll have to use a little bit of a geometry on that one, I think. And so I think that would be a great thing. So here's the deal. You figure out how to measure one, realizing that a lot of that beaver house is under the water. And you're going to have to, they're shaped more like a cone. So you're going to have to do some fancy math there. But if you can get the size of it, the area of it, you might even be able to figure out the volume of it. And that would be really cool, because they have to build those themselves. So that first image I had, they had built that lodge in about 2 weeks. And they only have this little chamber inside in which they live. Where is the largest beaver house? I don't know, but they say that the largest beaver dam is in Wood Buffalo National Park. So a dam is, of course, holding back the water. It would be more like the peat-based dams that you saw in that Sibbald slide. But I've also heard somebody say that one isn't the largest. I found one up in northwestern Alberta near Rainbow Lake. So you never know. There could be competitions out there for April 7th on B-Day. But I don't know where the largest beaver house is. I've seen some ones though that are duplexes where they have a lodge and then they build one right next to it and then they join them and they're massive. So I think that that's probably when the young are teenagers and they want to send them into another part of the house.
Okay, then the next question, any idea whether beaver ponds count as wetlands under the Alberta wetland policy?
Oh, it's complicated. I work in wetlands that have beavers. They are not formed by dams, and so they are classified as wetlands. But there is a big debate, and Dr. Suzanne Bailey was my PhD advisor, and she really pushed hard in the Water for Life strategy meetings that we used to have back in 2002 around the drought time, to have beaver ponds incorporated into the wetland strategies. And there was a fair amount of resistance because some people see them as temporary ponds. With that said, even when they are abandoned, sometimes these ponds that have the dams stay intact for years after the beavers are gone, and they still work as functional wetlands. So it's one of those areas where I think the debate is still open, because beavers will live in wetlands that are already classified as wetlands. But if they create a wetland, it's a little bit more of a gray area. And I think it's a great thing to be up for debate, because when you think about the positive ecological benefits of these beaver ponds relative to biodiversity, where you're getting really high measures of biodiversity, I think we really need to reassess those. And some of the groundwater recharge that is associated with these beaver ponds as well is just tremendous. It's the equivalent of a 1 in 500 year flood. That's what Dr. Westbrook's found, where if you get these beaver ponds set up, the surrounding groundwater systems are recharged just in an unbelievable way.
Well, yeah, that's really interesting. We do have another one. Is beaver management necessary in areas, mining areas or other, where areas have been fully reclaimed? If the beavers do damage that is contrary to what has been designed in the reclamation plan.
Yeah, I think that's a really important and a really insightful question, because we do a lot of reclamation, especially, let's say, in oil sands areas. And I've talked to government officials and industry folks that they build these new wetlands. They want them to function as wetlands, but when beavers move in, there's so much modification. I really think it depends on the reclamation goals and the location of these areas. I think that if there's a risk of there being toxic materials being released because you're trying to do a bioremediation where you need these things intact in a certain way in order to control the biological handling, like the microbial handling of some of the materials in these ponds, that would have a different management approach than not. Eventually, though, once they're left to be, beavers are going to move back because that's beaver habitat. I was working with Alberta Parks once, and they had a fairly old sewage lagoon, and beavers had gotten in there. And so we worked together to figure out how to keep beavers out of there, because especially during dry years, sewage lagoons are great for beavers. There's always water. There's always a water supply, and the vegetation around it grows quite well because it's a sewage lagoon. And so what we did was we ended up putting in a buried 4-foot high fence all the way around and cutting back the vegetation about 30 meters from the sewage lagoon, so that the beavers, number one, wouldn't be able to easily access the pond, but also if they could get out, there's not a lot of forage around that sewage lagoon, because if they dug through the clay liner in that sewage lagoon, it would have joined the sewage lagoon with all the neighboring wetlands, which is not what you're looking for when you're trying to treat sewage. So you really have to think about it from a site-by-site basis and what the reclamation goals are.
All right, and then the last one, will beavers share a lodge with others that are not their kids?
No, they share them with muskrats and voles. They don't mind them. But beavers are incredibly territorial and they communicate often through scent marking, and they can identify, it's like our fingerprints. The scent markings that beavers do are unique to the individual, and they can recognize each other's family relationship with them. Often I'll have people that are rehabilitating beavers. They find a baby beaver and they say, well, there's a lodge down the road. It has other baby beavers. Wouldn't it be fun to put them into play? Or I'm just going to put this solo beaver in with the other beavers. There's a high likelihood that they'll be killed by the resident beaver family. They are incredibly territorial unless they're looking for a mate, and they will fight. So what you can see in really high density beaver populations is lots of scarring on the beaver pelts. And so you know that the population is probably beyond carrying capacity because they're biting at each other. I've seen tails that have chunks taken out of them and everything. They will kill each other if they're crossing each other's territorial boundaries, or at least fight. So it's not a good idea to mix families. Let them do it themselves.
Yeah.
I saw a beaver fight once. It was pretty scary.
Yeah, they've actually killed people and dogs, and they have very sharp teeth.
Wow, that's a good way to end it, I'd say.
Oh, no.
Our last question.
Not with killing people and dogs.
No, I think, I mean, the takeaway that I got from the conversation and a lot of the questions is we need to think about beavers, sort of in line with the theme of our conversation today, is like, how do we collaborate with nature in the places where it makes sense, and follow the science. As you pointed out, we have a lot of maybe misconceptions around what beavers do and don't do. And I think it's just important, especially for people like me and those of us doing sort of watershed management or watershed stewardship, to really understand the role of beavers and some of the other semi-aquatic mammals. Because I know you do quite a bit of work across more than just beavers. So yeah, I think that we've got a lot to learn, and I always say follow the science, but I also sit down and talk to a lot of people who really live close to the land, and they've taught me just as much as many of the books that I've read. So I think we really have to listen as well as we have to do other things too. So it's a multi-front learning process. Yeah. Well, thank you for taking the time to present today, and for answering questions from everything from family relations to ecosystem services, if you will. So thanks very much, everyone. And that was Dr. Glynnis Hood from University of Alberta at Augustana.
Thank you for the invitation.
So our next speaker will be coming up in just half a second. It's Tim Romano from the Milk River Watershed Council. But before I pass the floor to him, I just did want to point out that today's webinar presentation is actually a collaboration amongst all of the WPACs in the province. Our education and outreach staff have been working hard behind the scenes to coordinate and set this all up. And so we're trying to live what we preach when it comes to collaboration. So now I'm going to turn it over to you, Tim, in half a second. So Tim, as I mentioned, is the executive director of the Milk River Watershed Council. So he is in the WPAC world just as much as I am. And he's going to be discussing some of the ways that his organization works with the neighbors across provincial and international boundaries. And the Milk River Watershed Council prides themselves on sort of practical projects where you can get on the ground and get your hands dirty and your feet wet. They work directly with producers, and they try the Alliance really tries to be responsive to challenges like drought and drought resiliency, wildlife species at risk, water quality, riparian area management, all of those types of things. And there are a transboundary watershed, but as most of our watersheds are, but the difference is that they get an international border, so they get to deal with the folks in the United States. Tim, I'm going to pass it over to you to let you take the floor, and please feel free to share your slides or whatever you might have.
Sounds great. Thanks, Scott. It sounds like Scott mentioned earlier that we were having some problems here too. There was a vac truck that was working on the power line right outside my building window here. So he just finished up. So touch wood, I think we're going to be in good shape. So yeah. So can you see my screen there, Scott? Everything looks
Yep,
good.
I can see you and hear you. It's all good.
Perfect. Yeah. I guess before I start my presentation, I wanted to say, I really appreciated that presentation from Dr. Glynnis Hood. I was wondering if she'd actually ever seen, when I first started working in the Milk River down here, I had a landowner tell me that the beavers, there's not as many trees, and the beavers will build dams and impound water with rocks. And I thought, he is totally full of it. And so one of my first farm visits, actually, I got to go for a drive and take a look, and you would think it was his grandkids that had gone and flipped large flat rocks together, and I've actually seen where the beavers were active with lodges in the stream bank, and would impound as much water as possible off of some of the smaller tributaries and on the main stem of the milk with rocks. So that was kind of my cool beaver story. Okay. I want to say greetings to everybody. I'm in lovely Milk River, Alberta today on traditional lands of the Blackfeet, and we proudly acknowledge their language, culture, and heritage, and involvement in the connection with the landscapes and sacred sites in our watershed as well. So, part of our work is really to foster reconciliation and healing as too with our communities. So just kind of a quick overview. I'm going to blast into a bit of the background on the Milk River watershed itself and some of the, as Scott alluded to, some of the transboundary nature and management, and maybe some water security challenges and species at risk. And the most important thing I think I'm going to come across with here is that our work isn't possible without partnerships. And that's really the theme of World Water Day is how we accelerate change with partnerships. So yeah, as Scott mentioned, we're one of 11 watershed planning and advisory councils in the province. Whoops, back that up. In the province of Alberta. We're personally a nonprofit charitable organization, and we try to provide that local voice for community concerns to be addressed through sound science and research, planning, monitoring, and stewardship activities. But as Scott mentioned too, this is just a small slice of the incredible diversity of projects and people that stitch together water and watershed management in Alberta. Please, wherever you folks are from, check out our WPAC compendium for more detailed information and roll-up of some of the work and numbers and how much leveraging we managed to do collectively across the province as WPACs, and watch for other opportunities for webinars and forums and tours. Even in the fall, I believe we're going to have a WPAC summit to really celebrate the successes of our watersheds and the areas that all of us call home. Getting into the Milk River watershed, as Scott mentioned, we're pretty much the smallest of the major watersheds in Alberta, but when you take in consideration the transboundary nature, we're actually quite large. We share at the head and the hip with Montana and Saskatchewan. Just for interest on the actual Milk River itself, we have about 350 farms and acreages that are reliant on either water co-op water from licenses from the Milk River or directly use the river themselves. We also have the communities of Milk River, Coots, and Sweetgrass sharing the border in Montana that are reliant on the river. We've got about 2,400 residents in the watershed, so quite few and quite dispersed. In total, about 400 commercial farms and ranches, and it includes significant portions in Alberta from the county of Cardston, Warner, 40 Mile, and Cypress to the east. We got a diverse board that kind of makes up our interests so that we have all stakeholders represented well. The watershed itself is about 65% in Montana, so that Only about 11% shows up in Alberta and 24% in the area that we call the South of the Divide in Saskatchewan. And one of the most important maps I kind of have in my presentation is this one on land cover. You know, ranching remains a way of life for many in the watershed. About 40% of farms specialize in beef production. We're outnumbered, 7 to 1 roughly, over almost 70,000 head of 70 to 1, almost 70,000 head of cattle are home in the watershed, and largely a lot of cow-calf operations. Over 80% of the species at risk that are found in Alberta are in the watershed, largely due to that 81% of the watershed remaining native intact rangelands. Of that breakdown, about 60% of that native rangeland is public land, which is all under grazing leases, and the balance in private landholders. There is a lot of pressure from challenges with species at risk. Additional species continue to be added annually, it seems, and often it's kind of due to a lack of understanding or population dynamics. Many of these species are found at the fringes of their native range in Alberta, and it's provided a real opportunity for our watershed council to look at ways to support landowner stewardship, habitat, and native rangelands. And a significant forage deficit is in the watershed, which means that we don't produce enough forage for the amount of livestock that are home here. And it means that water is extremely critical for a ranching community to offset that production. In regards to irrigation, irrigation is used to augment that forage production from our native rangelands, and there's about 66 water licenses for about 40 farm families that withdraw from water for irrigation purposes right directly off of the milk. This works out to about 8,600 acres of irrigation in Alberta. There's no irrigation districts, so all irrigators are private and independent. And our watershed council really works to try to provide a voice for those water users and ensure that there's as much information as possible for them in order to enact best practices and have timely information about the system itself. Irrigation accounts for about between $6 and $7.7 million in economic activity annually. And irrigated acres are split out about 40% for directly for forage production, approximately 40% annually on cereals and oilseeds, and specialty crops and contract crops result in about 20% of the production. So that's really, again, when we're talking about connectivity to Montana, that's a drop in the bucket, the literal bucket, compared to the 150,000 plus acres of irrigation in the High Line of Montana. So just a little bit about the Milk River. It starts from large springs at the toe slopes of Glacier National Park in Montana, where the middle and the South Forks join and cross into Canada east of Del Bonita. The South Fork joins the North Fork, which meanders along the Milk River Ridge after it crosses into Canada near Whiskey Gap. And then this is a shot here from the, from the Sandstone Ranch on the North Fork in Alberta. The gravel bottom reaches parallel to the border east of the town of Milk River with shallow aquifer formations contributing to the base flow, and wind erosion forming hoodoos and the sandstone valley that drops wide east. In the shadow of the Sweetgrass Hills, the river touches sacred sites like Writing on Stone, and the channel continues to change, becoming wider with the beginning of the sandbed reach as it enters the Milk River Canyon. Through the Pinhorn Ranch, fossils of ancient seas wash away, and the valley drops over 600 feet in spots, and additional bentonite clays bring the milky color of the river. quiet open country of the Badlands and extensive ranching operations are often only disturbed by the startled elk. After nearly 300 kilometers in Alberta, the river turns southeast again and enters into the High Line of Montana to the communities of Havre, Malta, and then numerous ghost towns lost in time before Glasgow, Montana. So the river ends its journey with the confluence of the Missouri River just before Fort Peck Dam in Montana. And this is the area where famously named the Milk River, Lewis and Clark said the waters of the river possess a particular whiteness, being about the color of a cup of tea with a mixture of a tablespoon of milk. So to really understand some of the major water challenges in the watershed, we got to go right back. This is a shot from 1912 and part of the A. Brown collection. In the late 1800s, settlement was underway in the Canadian portion of the basin. Large herds of cattle were moved and replaced the grazing bison from the east and the south in the basin. The first establishments were by the Spencer brothers, and then ranches with familiar family names that we have today, including the Gilcrests, the Ross, the Wallace Ranch. Water was always a concern then. The natural flow of the Milk River was unreliable and the winters were difficult. In the early 1900s, the newly formed U.S. Bureau of Reclamation commissioned a project to move water from the St. Mary's River Basin up over the Continental Divide and down into the North Fork of the Milk River, where it traveled over 300 kilometers before re-entering the parched north central Montana High Line, which at the time was largely unsettled, and bringing irrigation water for the development of farms and ranches in Havre through Malta and Glasgow. At the same time, irrigation was already being established down in Kimball on the St. Mary's River in Canada, and the canal was being built to open irrigation development throughout the district and bring water to Lethbridge. Down by Babb, Montana, 2 sets of 8-foot siphons with incredibly engineering for the time were forged in Chicago, then steamed up as far as Great Falls before loaded on wagons and horses and mule trains that brought them over to where this photo was taken. Before, of course, the wind strewn everything around, which is different than today. Those hand steam riveted siphons, 26 miles of canal, 5 concrete drop structures, the Sherburne Dam and the St. Mary's Diversion Dam opened up that northern Montana to settlement, growing food for over 1 million Americans annually. But it didn't get completed without some bristles from the Canadians. Within days of completion of what was called the Spite Ditch, when the Americans were talking about diverting the entire flow of the St. Mary's into the milk system, the Canadians decided that they needed to build their own canal to bring that water back into the Old Man Basin. They completed a canal structure affectionately called the Spite Ditch. And within days, the two countries, the water only ran in the canal for one day, is what the story says. And it was within days that the two countries got back to the negotiating table. Despite that the Canadians were lacking in friendliness, the Boundary Waters Treaty was soon forged afterward, which really was the birthplace of the International Joint Commission, which upon signing of the 1909 Boundary Waters Treaty, recognized that water management of the two rivers would be apportioned as one. And in the apportionment agreement signed in 1921, we've been served well for over 100 years of successful water management. This also set the stage for joint watershed management from coast to coast between the two countries. So fast forward until the early 2020s, 100 years later, the system has been largely unchanged. Our communities have both grown and retracted over time on both sides of the border, and the infrastructure that was absolutely incredible for its time and largely now in a state of near failure. It served us well for over 100 years, but as in the A.E. Brown photo in 1912, generations have come without knowing the natural Milk River conditions for a full season. On May 17th, 2020, the last drop structure that brings the water from the St. Mary's down into the valley to the North Fork of the Milk River failed. This really tested the resilience of our communities on both sides of the border. With cooperation from the Canadians, and especially I have to hand it to our elected officials and border services, and the coordination from the Milk River Joint Border Control, the system was repaired at a breakneck speed. But the 2020 diversion failure was a good opportunity to learn more about our system. The unique challenges that we have with water security in the milk really were tested, and we do know that future water management scenarios with climate change really is going to see some variation in rainfall and likely prolong more deficits. So we're right at that thin edge of the blade in terms of drought management and water management. And this really pushed both our watershed council and both countries, to be honest, to bring water security to the forefront for everybody. So this has been kind of a good news story. There's been a big investment in water security and understanding better our system. Projects like irrigation consumptive use monitoring was initiated by the U.S. Geological Survey in cooperation with environmental parks and protected areas. The Watershed Council has worked with our community members to develop a water shortage contingency plan, which has kind of identified those short-term actions that we need to take within the community to address what happens when we get into a shortage situation for both our urban communities and how they use water and source water, as well as challenges with regards to fire suppression water and the usage and reporting of water from irrigators across the watershed. And another really unique study that was opportunistically undertaken in 2020 was doing isotopic signature analysis of the base flow, of the natural flow of the Milk River during the non-diversion period. And that's really given us some insight in terms of better understanding what the dynamics are for channel losses, channel inputs from groundwater, where and when we're seeing the most challenges in terms of water management. And likely the biggest project that came out of this is a $1.8 million project being conducted by the International Joint Commission directly on studying the St. Mary's and the Milk River to look at both administrative and structural recommendations to improve water management in the future. So I wanted to step back a little bit at this point and recognize that a good friend of mine says watershed work doesn't stop at the river ties us all together. And over 80%, again, as I mentioned, the species at risk are found in Alberta, are found in our watershed with that large amount of rangelands, including northern leopard frogs as seen in this picture. Partnering with biologists from Department of Fisheries and Oceans and EPA, we've been able to fill some of those knowledge gaps with regards to species at risk, including stonecat, catfish, western silvery minnow, and others. But not only in those riparian areas and wetlands is that important, but our parched upland habitats are equally as important. Like those for rare species only found in the watershed, like the shorthorn lizards. And rangelands really are working landscapes.
Okay.
In our work, we do recognize that we need to work closely with our producers and help provide the tools and and to support practical management of these areas for issues like sharp-tail and sage grouse. And we even assist with augmenting habitat for species like Virginus hawk and other species that keep the pests under check for producers, including rattlesnakes, bull snakes, and recently discovered eastern yellow-bellied racer. Back to the river that ties us together. Monitoring and research are essential to management, and with our partners, we've completed over 16 years of continuous river water quality and tributary monitoring work. That's a big shout out to all our partners that have made this possible, including our municipal partners that have been critical for this. That data has been essential to better understand those watershed impacts from drought, fire, and even challenges like municipal effluent on our aquatic ecosystem. Plus, much of this information has made its way into state of the watershed reporting. And just for so you know, that's a St. Mary's sculpin in the top left corner. It's only found in the western reach of the watershed, and their entire life history occurs in a small home range of only about 2 to 3 cubic meters of the river. Partnering with private landowners, we've been able to expand knowledge on lesser known species such as the little brown bat. Approximately 70 landowners have been involved with this project so far, and it's really been a gateway to do more species at risk work and build a bigger community of practice with regards to telling those good news stories and hopefully better understanding the dynamics of that are important for riparian areas and for uplands. In regards to education outreach, social media channels and events like this webinar really do help everybody better understand the challenging issues and reduce some of that polarization and finger pointing that often happens, unfortunately, in our world today. Programs like Youth Range Day since 2008 is probably one of the most successful partnerships that we've done with watershed management and range management in our area. And this year is just a small plug. This year's Range Days is actually moving to the Del Bonita area. And it's a great opportunity where we get kids out to those working landscapes and they understand everything from range management to the aquatic environment. And you know, many of our students in the past have gone on to careers and management of their own ranches, as well as fish and wildlife management and conservation enforcement roles, to education, and we've been really successful at that. In terms of stewardship, we've worked close with over 100 producers on stewardship work over the years. Our WRP work alone has leveraged a $250,000 grant that we were successful in receiving from the provincial government into over $500,000 worth of projects in a short period of time. So that worked out to about 25 watering systems and remote systems with producers, many kilometers of riparian corridor fencing, electric fencing, and improved management of over 2,000 head of livestock. Drought resiliency, again, if in 2020 we have producers that said that if we weren't there to support some of their work, they would have had to rethink a lot of their operations. And we've been able to double down on this project as well. And we've partnered to reinvest in extension and support tools to continue to help support producers management in the area. And the last big project that I really wanted to show that was transboundary and involved a lot of partners is that we're working to complete 2023 transboundary state of the watershed report. So it's been 10 years since our last transboundary edition. You know, it's for better or worse, this pandemic had forced a lot of people into doing more virtual work, and we've been able to successfully recruit over 75 team members from all 3 jurisdictions, with leadership from the Milk River Watershed Council, the South of the Divide Conservation Action Program in Saskatchewan, and the Milk River Watershed Alliance, our sister organization in Montana, and the Milk River Joint Board of Control, which manages the irrigation districts in Montana. We've had financial contributions committed from all 3 jurisdictions. This is just an incredible undertaking that probably could not be done if it wasn't for the support from data to corner of the desk summaries of research and all the different work that's been happening from NGOs, federal, state, and provincial partners, GIS data. It's phenomenal, and it's the years in the works, but we're really close to the finish line. So I'm excited to be able to share that soon. And so again, on this World Water Day, I just wanted to, I just wanted an opportunity to be able to provide hopefully people some hope and inspiration for the future. We have big challenges ahead of us, but solutions both small and large, both structural and natural, like we've been talking about today, they're there for the taking. We've got teams of skilled people pulling in the same direction, not just here in the Milk, but across Alberta and in a lot of ways it looks like across the world. So thank you to everybody who organized and participated in the webinar, and to all the organizations on this page. Thank you for your generous support and hours of work that have supported the work over the years, and particularly in the last little while. So that's kind of all I have, Scott.
Excellent. Well, I think there's probably a few questions in the chat. I know I typed one, so I know there's one for sure. I had the chance myself to work. I've done fisheries work all over, so I've done stonecat work in the Milk River, and it's a beautiful, beautiful landscape down there. Jill and Kate, what do we have on tap for questions for Tim?
Yeah, we've got a few questions, and yeah, we don't have a ton of time left, so we'll try to get through them if we can. So one question is that the Milk River relies on the diversion from St. Mary's. How will a changing climate affect that reliance? Will there be a time that the diversion might have to stop to keep the St. Mary River flowing?
That's a great question. There's a lot of work being done with regards to in-stream flow needs and environmental flows. There's I guess the biggest advantage coming at this point for the system is that we do have Sherburne Reservoir in Montana. But it's interesting because a lot of the original treaty, the Boundary Waters Treaty, was really a lot about the actual volumes of water and how we split those volumes of water, but not a lot was done in terms of what the impact is to aquatic ecosystems. And I got colleagues on both sides of the border that think of us as a canal, a conveyance only for Montana. And we're trying to do our best to make sure that we manage that for the aquatic ecosystem as well. So it's a big balancing act, and climate change is going to continue to put pressure on our resources for sure.
I imagine so.
All right, the next question, how does water use or licenses compare between the Alberta section of the Milk River watershed and its US stretch? Is water use also irrigation heavy on the Montana side?
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned in one of my slides for regards to irrigation. Alberta, we've got about 8,600 acres, which is works out to continual diversion in the summertime during the peak usage period would be about 1.5 cubic meters per second. In Montana, we're talking 16.5 cubic meters per second. So they've got about 150, they've got a lot of skin in the game, so to speak, in terms of ensuring that this infrastructure is maintained and repaired in the future, because they've got literally cities that are reliant on it. The city of Havre it gets their water from Fresno Reservoir, and then down the irrigators, 150,000 acres are really reliant on that.
Right. Another question we have is, how is your relationship with your US counterparts?
Honestly, I think there was a time even 20 years ago where that bristly nature that brought about the spike ditch was maybe was maybe back again. And there was a protectionist attitude where I've got board members on my side that say we're donating every year 20 to 30,000 acre feet of water to Montana. I'm not getting credit for it. But the flip side is that we're benefiting probably 90,000 acre feet of water in the St. Mary's system that's unaccounted for, that would be entitled to the United States as well. So there's skin in the game from both sides. And in the past, there's been discussions about storage structures on the Canadian side to capture that 20,000 acre feet and expand irrigation. And the reality is that unless we work together to manage this as one basin on both sides of the border, nobody's going to benefit. And so there's been a change. And I'd say in the last probably 5 or 6, maybe even 10 years, the attitudes have changed, and communication and dialogue is way better now. And we're looking at ways of managing this as one basin instead of just protecting our every last drop for both countries.
That's good to hear. That's kind of tough to talk about water as if like one person owns it over another.
All right, we have one last question in the chat. It says, is high temperature in the summer a concern for fisheries in the milk during low flows?
That's a great question. We tried to collect as much data and information as possible in 2020 when the diversion failure happened, because that was the first time in 105 years that we'd seen that natural flow only. And we really have a tale of two rivers, because the diversion period in the summer, the water quality improves, the temperatures drop. It's a completely different river than natural flow in the winter months when there's no diversion, or when the diversion failure happened and there was that. So yeah, temperatures were quite high during the diversion failure in the late summer months. We had about 26 or 28 observations of fish stranding, a lot of large body fish that were getting picked off because they didn't have as much cover. But it's a good news story too, because the fisheries work that was done that year, and then the follow-up work that was even done this past fall, we might have lost some of the older age classes, but there is enough cover and side habitat that the fish actually managed quite well, and they did okay despite the conditions. They're really well adapted for these higher temperatures. These aren't largely these aren't salmonids, except for a little bit on the North Fork of the Milk River, and they've done well to adapt to these conditions. And the farther down the river you get into Montana, like there's Pleiades sturgeon, there's some really cool stuff happening down there, and like we're on our side, the stone cat is the only catfish that we have that's native to Alberta, so it's pretty cool that we have that.
So,
is that the last of our questions?
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, I wanted to say thanks, Tim, for taking the time to walk us through your experience with the Milk River and some of the challenges you've got. I know every WPAC has sort of a different perspective on these types of things. And so if you talk to any of our exec director folks that are leading the different groups, there's always some issue there's some similar flavors, but they're all sort of unique to the landscape, which is kind of really cool to see. So thanks for taking the time to show us the view from the south, right on the border there. Excellent. So we're just in the wrapping up phases for our webinar today. There's only a couple more things to do. The first thing I was going to do is shout out for our prize pack winner. So through random selection through everybody who attended, the winner of the pack is Marilee Patterson Perry. And so we'll make sure you get that, the dry bag and the environment swag and the riparian portal backpack as well. So we'll make sure that gets to you.
Thank you. Wow. That's wonderful. What a surprise. Thank you.
Thanks, Marilee. And the last thing is be sure to check out some of the resources that are available for World Water Day. Obviously, the UN site itself has a lot of resources, but make sure you check out all of the different WPACs, especially the WPAC where you might be living. Each one has its own suite of resources that are specific to their watershed and specific to the issues in that watershed. There's also local watershed stewardship groups. These are the most local of our our partnership groups. And then also, if you're interested in sort of provincial level partnerships, take a look at the Alberta Water Council website. They have lots of cool projects going that span the entire province. So with that, I just want to say thank you to all of the engagement and outreach folks from all of the different watershed groups who helped organize today and make people like me and Tim and others and Glynnis look good to speak and provide this information, but it goes back to the hard work of this team that put it all together. So thanks very much to everyone and to all of my WPAC counterparts for contributing. And with that, that is the end of our watershed, our little webinar for today for World Water Day 2023. So thanks everyone, and thank you for attending.